Connected in 3D, Real-Time Solutions and Digital Twins podcast with your host, Ashley Crowder.
Welcome back to Connected in 3D, where we dive into the real-world impact of 3D, AI, and immersive technology. I'm your host, Ashley Crowder, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by someone who's at the forefront of turning emerging tech into meaningful enterprise solutions. Cortney Harding is an in-demand expert helping Fortune 100 companies harness the power of AI, spatial computing, and virtual reality. She developed AI-powered avatars for brands like Amazon and McDonald's, and created VR training programs tackling everything from racial bias to mental health for companies like Walmart, PwC, and Target. Her work has earned her numerous accolades, including an Emmy nomination, South by Southwest Audience Award, and recognition as one of the best VR AR products at Mobile World Congress. She's also a faculty member with Fast Future, co-author of Fast Future Blur, and has taught at Caltech, NYU, and even co-created Meta's What is the Metaverse course on Coursera, and has been a friend of mine for a long time. So, Courtney, welcome to the show. So excited to dig in with you.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Awesome. So, you've worked with huge enterprises like Verizon, Walmart, and Accenture. What are the most compelling enterprise use cases for immersive technology you're seeing today? And how have those evolved over the past 5 years?
Yeah, so it's really focused on training. And I think, when people tend to think of VR training, they tend to maybe think of hard skills training, right? So like welding or plumbing or climbing a telephone pole. And those are all really, really strong use cases. And I've worked on some and they're fantastic. But I think you can also train people on behaviors. And when I sit down with clients, that's the first thing I really, really dig into is like, are you training on a skill or a behavior? And really understanding where the flaws in their training are, where maybe their training could be improved, and then really figure out, are you really teaching somebody how to like operate a forklift? In that case, amazing, let's do that. Or is the reason you're having forklift accidents because you changed the layout of your warehouse and people don't know how to like look for hazards anymore, stuff like that. So it's really kind of digging in and figuring out, where this technology can be applied the best, because I think it cuts across almost every skill set. There are some use cases where it doesn't work. I think if you're going to teach somebody, for example, how to use Excel, like just use Excel,
Yeah.
or don't, because it's boring, but my point, right? So there's a handful where it's not going to work as well, but pretty much every use case you can think of will translate really well into VR training.
Yeah, that's really interesting because at Ventana we definitely focus more on products and equipment because we're a 3D content management platform. But to your point, even if that is training around something like a forklift, it can be those human factors and engineering within the setup or processes that need better training. That's really interesting. And like from that business perspective, like how are people choosing use cases? How are they measuring that impact? What once you kind of align on what key problem are they trying to solve? How do you kind of go about implementing that and making sure the business can really understand the value?
Yeah, so there's two places I think where people tend to not think when they're starting a VR training program. And the first is, what is the flaw in our current training? And I tend to look at it in three buckets. Obviously, these are not comprehensive, but generally the problem is one of three buckets. One is your training is interesting and useful, but the way it is presented is not. So if people are scrolling through endless PowerPoints, if they're watching silly videos that they can kind of skip through, if they're sitting on endless Zoom calls, right? The information you're presenting could be really good, but people are just sort of like zoned out, right? That's not how people want to consume information. So that's the first. The second is that it's too expensive, right? So if you're trying to train at scale, that gets expensive very quickly if you're doing it like in person. And the third is that it's not scalable. So if everyone is having to fly to your warehouse once a quarter to do a big training where they're using equipment or climbing poles or whatever, then that's great. But the cost of that is really high. And also it doesn't scale beyond the number of people you could fit in a warehouse, right? There's always ceilings when it's like in-person training, just because like the fire marshal has rules, Like, it's infinitely scalable, whereas VR is infinitely scalable. So that's the first thing I sort of guide people through is like, what exactly is the problem you're trying to solve? Now, in some cases, there's like a problem that is on fire, right? So there's too many forklift accidents. Or in one case, I had a woman who took over an HR department called me and said, all of our Black employees have quit in the last year, and we need to like figure out why and train people to not be racist. Right. So
Wow.
sometimes there's an on fire problem that you need to solve quickly. Other times you can be a little bit more thoughtful. I always caution people, right? Don't bite off more than you can chew, right? So do one thing, do two things, do a handful of things to get started, right? Don't try to reinvent the wheel completely. And then really think about like what you're going to measure as your outcome. Because that's, I think, where people do get lost a lot of the time is they don't clearly think about, okay, well, what are we training towards, right? And what are we benchmarking against? So if your current training program using PowerPoints and videos has a 50% success rate, then you want 50% plus one on the VR side of things. So how are you tracking that, right? With hard
Hmm.
skills, it's kind of easier. Sometimes it's like time to proficiency or retention of information or fewer accidents. With the behavior stuff or quote unquote soft skills, it's a little harder, right? It's harder to measure whether people are like nicer or having better conversations. But
Hmm.
you can look at, employee satisfaction surveys, manager satisfaction surveys. Did they feel better about the conversations they're having? Is turnover down? Are lawsuits down? Are all of your non-white employees all of a sudden not quitting, right? Like there's all these different ways you can measure it. I worked on a project where it was geared at social workers. And the first state that actually implemented it saw their turnover rate drop by a third, right?
Wow.
Which is really huge, both from sort of a perspective of like continuity for people who need care. That's really important,
Hmm.
but also just for like cost to taxpayers, right?
Yeah.
So kind of understanding like exactly what are you measuring against, and then having that sort of end-to-end program where it's like, okay, we're constantly measuring, we're constantly like again learning. It's not, you're not going to hit it out of the park every single time, but really having those like debrief sessions, talking to your users, and kind of this continuous improvement cycle.
Yeah, I think that's so important. So, it's like VR, XR, it's not this totally different thing, right? It's just training in a different method. So, how are you measuring training today? Let's apply that there. That makes total sense. And making sure, I think you mentioned in the beginning, starting small. I think Delta had a really great example. Like their very first VR training was just walking around an airplane and looking at, I think it's called FOD. I forget what it stands for, but like the random stuff lying
Yeah.
around. Um, from a development standpoint, that's really honestly easy, quicker, and cost effective to build. And then once they prove the value, then they started creating more interactive,
Yeah.
experiences. So that makes a
And
lot
I
of
think
sense.
the key there though is don't just be one and done. Right.
Yeah.
So I agree and I encourage people to start with one or two, but to have a plan for expanding it. Because what I've seen happen a lot, and I'm going to use a term that I like and that I stole from somebody, but I like it. It's pilot purgatory. And I've
Mm.
seen so many companies do this where they get excited, they go buy headsets, they build a few things, and then they kind of just let it slide, right? And sometimes it's because the person who was the internal champion switches jobs or gets laid off or budget cuts. There's always those type of things. But I think people don't ever think about, okay, yeah, we're going to start with one or two, but then we're going to keep an eye towards how do we do 50 or 100. And that's where another part of what I do comes in is training people on your team to create projects.
Mm.
So whether that's using like a 360 camera, whether that's hiring some Unity devs, whether that's using these sort of DIY creation platforms that are in the market now, that's really important because at the end of the day, the only way this technology scales is if everyone can create it. Now, everyone is obviously not going to be creating stuff that's like winning awards or, big picture stuff, right? But like, if you think of it like 2D video, there are still people that are among the best 2D video creators in the world, right? These people are winning Oscars, they're winning Emmys, they're creating stuff that's on Netflix. But when we think about how we consume 2D video, right, a lot of it is sort of the top tier of creators right here. Then there's this sort of smaller sub tier of people that are semi professional creators. So TikTok stars, Instagram
Hmm.
stars, whatever. But the bulk of it is like, here's a video of my friend's cat. Here's a video of my friend's kid being cute, right? And that's what we're consuming. And that's obviously like not, Oscar level, but it's still stuff that we're consuming and it's user generated. And where VR is falling short right now is we have sort of a subset of people who are very, very good at creating this stuff. We don't have that UGC content yet, and that'll come, but it needs to come relatively quickly. And there are differences creating this stuff between 2D and 3D. And it's all like very learnable. I learned it, I wasn't like born with this knowledge. No one is. So
Yeah.
it's all learnable, but you do kind of have to learn it. And so I think that's where a lot of the holdup is right now is there's just sort of a mismatch of skills. And so that's what I've been very focused on, as well as creating content, is teaching people how to create content.
Yeah, that's great. I talk a lot, people expect like a AAA game level training experience. And it's like, yes, we can create that like EA games, right? But it's very expensive and time consuming and probably doesn't make sense. And
Yeah,
if the end goal is just to make sure there's less forklift accidents, does this
right.
really need to look photorealistic? Probably
Yeah.
not. They just need to understand, you know, point A to point B and how to get there. And so that kind of leads into, your approach for onboarding large enterprise
Mhm.
clients who might be new to immersive tech, especially when it involves change management and behavior shifts. So kind of like how do you kind of set them up for success?
So the first thing I do is I find out who the internal champions are, and then I help them kind of spread it throughout the org. And I make sure that they have people lined up. And because the worst thing that could happen is if it's like one person who's super enthusiastic and they don't have buy-in, then they're going to be miserable and frustrated. I'm going to be miserable and frustrated because I'm going to spend my time creating something, and sure, I'll get paid for it and yay, but it's just going to sit on a shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't tell you how many things I've built that are literally just sitting on digital shelves somewhere. And it's frustrating. And it's the nature of the game, but it is frustrating because one person got excited, they got a little bit of money, they got a couple of headsets, and then they didn't sort of socialize it throughout the org and get the buy-in. So I make sure that people are really set up in terms of, if you're going to test this, do you have a control group and a non-control group? Do you have the time? Do you have the bandwidth? Do you have the budget? Do you have the wherewithal? Because, you're going to need to like manage the headsets, set up the headsets. And again, none of this is like hard, but it takes some time. And you kind of need like a team and enough people who are also excited to, if not build it, at least try it. Um, and that's, I think, getting easier. Like I'm encountering a lot less resistance now than I did several years ago when I was starting. I think a lot of people have used VR in their sort of day-to-day lives. Their kids have headsets, they have headsets for gaming, they've gone to location-based entertainment centers. So there's familiarity with the technology, and the technology is like much easier to use, right? In terms of like design, in terms of the headsets are lighter and you don't need gaming computers. So all of that stuff is great. But again, I think folks really need to think of like, is this feasible right now? Do I have the bandwidth and the support to do it? The place where I see people getting also kind of tripped up is around kind of the logistics.
Mm.
And, you know, like a lot of these headset companies now have really great multi-device management platforms. A lot of them are easier to set up and use. But the idea that it has to like conform exactly at this point, especially when it's early stages, like it doesn't necessarily need to. Like you can kind of play outside the rules a little bit. Um, and I had one client who I was doing a workshop for, and there was one woman in particular who just was so weirdly laser focused on like device management. And I kept saying to her, well, I'm like, these are just Android devices. Like the same people who manage your
Yeah.
computers and your smartphones, like these are just, I mean, yeah, they might need more people because there are more devices, but it's not this completely other thing. And I think she just couldn't like wrap her head around that.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's what's kind of frustrating is we do run into like IT departments run by some like dinosaur who's been there for 50 years. And it's just like, bro, get out of the way. You know, and I don't want to be dismissive of people who do like security because that's obviously important. But, I just think there are people who sometimes don't like think big enough or try big enough, or they just want to like do things as they've always been done. And like those people we see time and time again, like become obsolete. And so, but when you're in a big company and you have this sort of sedimentary layer of people that have been there for 40 years and they're just counting the days, that's challenging. And I wish I had an answer to that, but I don't.
Yeah, and right. I mean, it goes back to that saying like nobody gets fired for choosing IBM. You know,
Yeah.
people are especially big organizations, inherently risk averse, and security is a big issue. But yes, it's a VR headset is just another Android or Apple device that can
Yeah.
be managed through your same cell phone channels. And, software is software. So if you require SOC 2 compliance, okay, your VR experience needs SOC 2 compliance. It doesn't have to be a completely new framework. So I think
Yeah.
that's really important. And I know you've worked with both hardware agnostic and device specific deployments. There's a lot of different options out there. What trends are you seeing in terms of what platforms and ecosystems enterprises are starting to standardize on? Because the more we get standardization, actually, the easier I think all this becomes. And then, these IT teams get more comfortable.
Yeah, so I think it's still kind of the Wild West, and part of that is so let me back up a little bit. So on the hardware side of the house, right? It's basically a two company market, and one company is in the U.S. anyway, light years ahead, which is in terms of sales, not in terms of technology. So in the U.S., it's Meta and Pico. Um, Meta is just more well known, right? Because they're a consumer company. Pico focuses specifically on enterprise. So both are fantastic headsets. I've used both. I like both. I like the teams at both. Um, and they're functionally very similar just in terms of like ease of use, ease of deployment. Um, I think we'll see what Apple does, right? How they get into the market with the Vision Pro. We'll see what happens when Google launches their headset later this year, and what their sort of enterprise strategy is. But I think in terms of the hardware market, it's pretty much two players. In terms of the software market, it's really the challenge is not, I would say, so much standardization. It's like so many players come and go, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's not a lot of continuity, and I've seen recently a bunch of startups kind of go bust or get bought, and it's a shame. Um, and then if I'm like, Amazon, for example, and I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars buying licenses and creating content for a platform, and then all of a sudden, poof, gone. That's going to make me very hesitant to keep investing in this, right? Because it's a
Right.
huge pain to then take all the content I've created, port it to find another platform, port it to another platform, get those licenses, get that budget. So I think the challenge that I'm seeing is if people do want to use these third-party platforms, sort of how stable are they? And that's again just the nature of working with small startups. But I think that's a lot of the pushback I've gotten more recently is like, we did something with X company or X developer, they were great, and then they went under, they left, right? So I think that's the challenge now.
Yeah, and I think some ways to mitigate that are, just contract perspective. A lot of times enterprises will ask for, I'm totally blanking on the term right now, but basically if you go bankrupt, then you get to give them your code. So I'm totally blanking on the name of that clause, but so you're not,
Right.
out of luck, and then, I'm really excited about Android XR
Yes.
coming out, because I think once we have more of that standardization, like we have with mobile devices, Android versus Apple,
Yeah.
even if you do choose a company that builds you a software and they go out of business, well, if it's built on Android XR, there should be lots of other Android XR developers,
Right.
just like there's lots
Yeah.
of other Android mobile device developers. And
Yeah.
so I'm really excited about that, because I think it'll help stabilize for sure. And then, I'm with you on the headsets. Quest is just such a great, it's like the best bang for your buck. I love Pico too. They are a Chinese company. We were chatting earlier today about how all these tariffs are going to affect them. And it's, crazy for a lot of people right now. So we'll see.
I think interestingly though, on the flip side, if the tariffs do have the effect that has been at least socialized or promised, that will potentially result in a lot more jobs kind of coming back to the US and growing in the US. And then what better way is there to train people very quickly than
Right.
VR, right? So I do think that while there's going to be obviously some downsides, right, especially with imported products, there are potentially also upsides in terms of, if you really want people to upskill very, very fast, that's this is like literally the best way possible is to do this.
Definitely. And what are some of those stats? Because I know there's been multiple studies that VR just it is proven to train people better and faster. And if all of a sudden we have to start manufacturing things we've literally not manufactured in the US for 50 years or more, how are we going to do that?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of research out there. PwC produced a report in 2020 now, so it's been out for several years, that talks about soft skills in particular and sort of emotional connection to the content and sort of time to proficiency and sort of the cost curve of, yeah, obviously there are upfront costs, but eventually you hit a point and it's not that many users where it becomes then cheaper, actually. Projects I've worked on, it's been, 70% performance improvement, 75% retention improvement, 75% cost savings, a third fewer, like a third less turnover, right? So, these are not, and I say this a lot, these are not sort of like incremental numbers, right? If it was like, 5% here, 10% there, right? I couldn't really push people to go in that direction because it's like, yeah, that's nice, but given the amount of work you have to put in at the start, maybe it's not justified. But these are huge, huge, huge numbers, right? And there's just an ever increasing body of research on this. So, this is where I get frustrated because I've been doing this a long time, is these numbers come out, they come out all the time. We see case study after case study. And then it's like, okay, but what's the holdup? Because if I'm running a company, I'm seeing those numbers. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay, let's do this. And again, I think there's just sort of that hesitation that, like you said, nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Nobody gets fired for like, let's make a video about compliance.
Yeah.
With a bunch of actors who aren't very good, right? And a bunch of very cheesy situations. Rather than thinking about like, how do we build something that people actually want to use and enjoy using and get something out of? And so I think part of it is just like a mindset shift towards how we look at training workers. Because a lot of it feels very sort of rote at this point. A lot of it's like, our lawyers told us we'd have to do this,
Yeah.
not like we're actually interested in helping you learn. It's like our lawyer said you have to,
Yeah.
so we have to. And
Yeah.
so I think that's just a little bit of a mindset shift. But I do think, there are like really big challenges when it comes to people doing like skilled labor. So there's a shortage of plumbers, there's a shortage of welders. Those are skills that can be taught in VR, right? And taught at scale. If manufacturing jobs will grow or different types of jobs will grow. So I think there's just a lot of opportunity. I think it's just sort of, creeping forward slowly.
Yeah, and why does immersive media resonate so strongly in workplace training compared to traditional e-learning and video? Like what makes it stick from a behavioral science standpoint?
Well, so the biggest reason I think, and I'll show you, is so when I'm on my laptop screen, I have 50 other windows open. I've got my email, I've got my texts, I've got, obviously I'm not doing it when we're talking, but if I'm in a meeting where someone else is talking and I'm kind of zoning out, right? I'm like, oh, I'll check my email. Oh, I got to buy that thing
Yeah.
on Amazon. Oh, let me look at the New York Times. Oh, I'm interested scrolling, right? So it's distraction. It's the same with phones, right? We're constantly distracted, right? We're multitasking all the time. In a VR headset, this is an old Pico headset, but it's the one I had in front of me, right? You're locked in. You're fully surrounded. So unless you are someone like me who's kind of figured out how to multitask in a headset, because I kind of have to because I'm in headset so much, then you can't multitask, right? So that's it. That's kind of the one brute force thing. The second thing is you feel like you are in the situation, right?
Mhm.
So you're not just watching, you're not just sort of passively absorbing, you are actually doing. And that's, I think, where a lot of VR training kind of gets it wrong, honestly, is if people are just sort of in headset passively watching, it's a little bit pointless. It's a little
Yeah.
bit not like you might as well make a good video, right? And you probably will save
Yeah.
yourself some money and it'll be easier. There are a few instances where narratively it makes sense for people to be passive observers, but generally you want people to be active participants. You want them to feel like they're part of the story. And that's the thing you can do in VR really well, is make people feel like they are part of a story, part of an experience, and do it at scale. And do it in a way that's like you can repeat 50 times, do it in a way that you can practice in. So I think that's a lot of it is just like presence and interaction that is not possible in other mediums.
For sure. No, for sure. And I know there's been studies, it's because you remember it like a true experience.
Oh
And
yeah.
so that's so much more memorable than just, watching a video. And I know we spent a lot of time talking about learning and development. Are there, other departments like sales, compliance, customer service that you think are underutilizing this technology, or have you seen great use cases
Oh
there?
yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, like definitely manager training. So when people say what industry should use VR, what companies should use VR, well, every industry has managers, right? Like it doesn't matter if you're a healthcare company, if you're like a railroad company, if you build software, hardware, t-shirts, like you have, once you get to more than a few employees, right? People are managing other people.
Yeah.
And managers, no matter what they're doing, they need to be good at communicating, they need to be good at giving feedback, they need to be good at having difficult conversations, they need to be good at kind of all those core skills that very few people who are managers are trained for, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's some of the sort of managerial class goes to business school and they learn to do that, but the vast majority of the time people who manage other people became managers because they were good at their jobs, right?
Yeah.
Not because they were good at being managers, they were good at being producers. So like that to me is the biggest sort of low hanging fruit space across every industry. um, Looking at sale, like practicing sales appointments, practicing sales calls, customer service. How do you deal with an angry or irate customer? How do you deal with somebody whose grasp of English might not be that amazing? You have to kind of figure out what they're trying to say. How do you communicate with like empathy? How do you stand up for yourself? So yeah, I just like, again, once you get to really thinking about it, pretty much any industry, any company can benefit from this training.
Yeah. No, agreed. And to switch gears a little bit, I know we've got to mention AI because it's everywhere. As AI and XR converge, how are you thinking about scaling personalized or adaptive 3D training across large organizations?
So I was actually just talking about this on a call earlier today as well. So for the last year and a half, I've been building a lot of AI powered virtual humans.
Mm.
So basically, you kind of use a platform. You select a virtual human avatar, and you can customize them, and then you create a scenario, and then ChatGPT does the rest. So are they kind of imperfect? Yeah, a little bit, but they're getting really good, right? So even in the year and a half that I've worked on that, it's gone from these kind of clunky things to things that, they're not photorealistic, right? There is still a little bit of uncanny valley, but I mean, we're seeing advances in that technology constantly. And the conversations feel very fluid. There's occasional hallucinations, but guess what? Humans occasionally hallucinate, right? Humans say weird stuff all the time. So I think that's really exciting. And that's something that, again, can be done at scale, can be done to personalize it. On the like hard skills side of the house, that a lot of that still requires like game engines.
Mhm.
However, Meta announced fairly recently some ways to sort of take a still image and turn it into a 3D image, right? I've seen some companies starting to do these AI powered game development things. So you could actually say, put a green box here and put a red flag here and put it this here, right? And create these sort of interactive 3D things. And then use AI to not only do the creation, but kind of create the scenarios. So you can say randomize one of 5 scenarios happening. So I think that's relatively near term going to be possible. But you still need to know why you're doing it and how you're doing it. But I do think like the creation pipeline is going to get a lot easier.
Definitely. I know we are so excited about the AI 3D model creation, picture to 3D asset, which, yeah, no, it's not great yet. Like I showed it to one of like our retail clients, and of course they're like, oh, it's not real enough, for the Nike shoe. I'm just making it up.
Right.
But it's getting there. And again, when we talk about ease of creation and
Mhm.
use cases, and especially if we're talking about manager training, being able to just come up with various scenarios and actually react to you as the trainee in response is
Yeah.
huge. I think Cedar Sinai has some really interesting avatar for psychology. So it's like a virtual psychologist you sit with who can like have a conversation, and that's only possible because of AI. So I think we're just starting to see the beginning of this, which is really exciting. And I know that you've got so much knowledge, and we have only a little bit of time left. So I wanted to ask you kind of some rapid fire questions. What's one enterprise use case that always gets stakeholders excited?
Anything that saves a lot of money, right? Or anything that has like a very clear payoff. So for example, you have this expensive piece of equipment that very few people know how to use. We can train people to use it with, them not actually having to touch the piece of equipment until they're trained, right? That's a really good one. It's a really simple one. Anything that kind of has like a big payoff, which a lot of these do. So that's nice.
No, that makes total sense. And, they're bought in, they know they want to do this. What's the biggest hurdle Fortune 500 still face when adopting immersive tech? We touched on a few, but
I think it's time, right? I think people are stretched. I think people get excited about doing VR. And then I think once they kind of get into the creation process, they haven't really set aside the time to do it. And the lack of like planning, right? So I always stress like you need to really make sure you're super buttoned up with your plan and your timeline, and that it's somebody's actual priority. Because if it's just a bunch of people who have 10 other things they're working on and this is kind of their side hustle, it's not going to work as well. It's just going to take a really long time and people are going to get burned out and lose momentum. So you really just need to have like a plan and a commitment to start. Otherwise, you're just going to kind of be spinning your wheels.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last thing, what's one thing you wish more executives understood about XR's value?
How well it works, like the transformative power of it, right? And the need to invest, the need to be strategic about it, the need to think about it, make sure you're starting to build, because there are companies that are really, really investing in building right now. And it's going to be a huge differentiating factor for some of their competitors. So like if you're Walmart, you're doing a great job. I think Walmart's way far ahead and crushing it. A lot of their competitors have done very little to no work in the space.
Yeah.
So you really need to think like you're giving up a competitive advantage if you're not investing in this technology and this training right now.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Well, Cortney, thank you so much for joining us. If people want to reach out with questions, where can they find you?
So I have a very SEO friendly name. I have to thank my parents for predicting SEO in 1980 and spelling my name in kind of a unique way. So anyway, so yeah, I mean, I'm just under my name on everything. So I'm on LinkedIn, probably way too much. I'm on Instagram. My website is friendswithholograms.com is my company. My personal site is Cortney-Harding. So I'm pretty easy to find. I'll plug some of the teaching stuff that I have. So I have a course with New Mexico State University on sort of big picture spatial computing creation. I have a course on Caltech that is Caltech Executive Ed that is specifically focused on sort of human resources and virtual reality. And then I have the Coursera What is the Metaverse course. And then I work with Fast Future Executive. And we now have like our exec ed program and then sort of individual credentials. So people who aren't part of the exec ed program that is sponsored by their companies can also get some of that content. And I also have a book coming out in the fall. It's called The Spatial Race. I am almost finished with the first draft, which is exciting because that's been a beast of a project, but it's really fun. So it's going to be out on Fast Future Executive Press in October, exact date TBD.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much for joining, and I will definitely be talking to you soon.
Thank you for having me.